The announcement came over the speaker like a thunderclap. "Mr. Johnson, seat 2A? Could you please come to the front of the cabin?" Christopher Johnson looked up from his laptop. Around him, the first-class cabin of Flight 447 buzzed with the quiet sounds of wealthy travelers settling in. Ice clinked in crystal glasses. Leather seats whispered as passengers adjusted their positions. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. Christopher closed his computer slowly. Something in the flight attendant's voice made his stomach tighten. He'd heard that tone before, sharp, official, hiding something underneath. He stood up, at 6 feet tall, with silver threading through his close-cut hair. Christopher carried himself with the kind of calm that came from years of board meetings and business negotiations. His navy suit was perfectly tailored. His tie was silk. Everything about him said success. But he'd learned long ago that not everyone could see it. As he walked toward the front, he noticed other passengers watching. A businessman in seat 1C glanced up from his newspaper. A woman across the aisle stopped mid-sip of her champagne. Everyone sensed something was wrong. The flight attendant waiting for him wore a name tag that read Sarah Lewis. She was young, maybe 30, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her smile was professional, but her eyes were cold. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, though not quietly enough. "We have a situation." Christopher waited. He'd learned patience the hard way. "We've overbooked first class," Sarah continued. "We need you to move to economy. We'll refund the difference, of course." The words hung in the air like smoke. Christopher blinked once. "Excuse me? It's just, we have a passenger who needs a seat more urgently." Sarah's voice dropped even lower. "She's a platinum member. She has connections." Behind Sarah, Christopher could see another woman approaching. She was white, probably in her 50s, wearing a cream-colored pantsuit and carrying a designer handbag that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her face had the pinched look of someone used to getting her way. "Is there a problem?" the woman asked, looking past Christopher as if he were invisible. "No problem at all, Mrs. Harris," Sarah said quickly, her voice suddenly warm. "We're just arranging your seat now." Christopher felt something hot and familiar rise in his chest. Not anger, not yet. Something older than anger. Something that tasted like every time he'd been followed in a store. Every time someone had assumed he was a help instead of the boss. Every time his achievements had been questioned before they were acknowledged. "I paid for this seat," Christopher said, his voice calm but firm. "I have a confirmed reservation." Sarah's smile tightened. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but where's your supervisor?" "Sir, please don't make a scene." Sarah's voice hardened. "We can resolve this quietly if you just cooperate." Around them, the cabin had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching now. The businessman in 1C had lowered his newspaper. The woman with the champagne had set down her glass. Even the other flight attendants had stopped what they were doing. Christopher felt the weight of their stares. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked curious. None of them looked like they were going to help. "Mrs. Harris has been a loyal customer for 15 years, Sarah continued, as if that explained everything. "Surely you can understand that we need to take care of our most valued passengers." The implication was clear. You are not valued. You don't belong here. Christopher looked at Jessica Harris, who met his gaze with something between impatience and entitlement. Then he looked back at Sarah. "And if I refuse?" Sarah's expression shifted. The professional mask cracked just enough to show what was underneath. Contempt, barely hidden. "Then we'll have to call security and remove you from the flight. I'm sure you don't want that kind of attention." There it was. The threat: cooperate or be humiliated further. Christopher stood very still. His mind raced through options. He could fight this. He could demand to speak to a manager. He could make them call security and prove exactly what was happening here. He could turn this moment into the confrontation it deserved to be. But he'd fought battles like this before. He knew how they went. The black man makes a scene. The black man gets escorted off the plane. The black man becomes a problem, not a person. And in the end, nothing changes except his own dignity, torn to pieces in front of strangers. So he made a different choice. "Fine," he said quietly. Sarah blinked, surprised by his surrender. Oh, well, thank you for being reasonable. Reasonable. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Christopher walked back to his seat that was about to stop being his, and gathered his belongings, his laptop, his briefcase, his carry-on bag. Each movement was precise, controlled. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. As he collected his things, the businessman in onesie spoke up. "This doesn't seem right," the man said, his voice uncertain. Christopher looked at him, then do something about it. The man's mouth opened, closed. He looked away. No one else said a word. Christopher walked down the aisle toward economy. Behind him, he heard Jessica Harris settling into seat 2A, his seat, with a satisfied sigh. He heard the rustle of expensive fabric, the click of a seatbelt, the soft murmur of Sarah offering her champagne and warm towels. The walk from first class to economy felt like miles. The cabin changed around him. The seats got smaller. The carpet got worn. The air got thicker, heavy with the breath of hundreds of passengers crammed together. Children cried. Someone's bag jutted into the aisle. The overhead lights buzzed faintly. Christopher found his new seat, 34B. Middle seat, between a teenager playing games on his phone, without headphones, and a woman who was already asleep, her head lolling toward his space. He sat down. The seat barely reclined. His knees pressed against the seat in front of him. There was no power outlet, no personal screen, no space to work. For a long moment, Christopher just sat there. He stared at the seat in front of him, at the worn fabric and the stain that looked like old coffee. Then, slowly, he pulled out his phone. He opened his email, found the message he was looking for. Read it again. Subject, final contract review, Skybridge Airlines partnership. Dear Mr. Johnson, we are thrilled to move forward with your company, TechVision Solutions, on what will be the largest technology integration contract in Skybridge Airlines history. The $280 million deal will revolutionize our booking systems, customer service platforms, and operational efficiency across all 450 aircraft in our fleet. Christopher's finger hovered over the screen. Then he began to type. But before we see what he wrote, we need to understand how he got here. We need to understand who Christopher Johnson really was, and why this moment mattered more than anyone on that plane could possibly imagine. 6 weeks earlier, Christopher Johnson stood in front of a conference room filled with executives from Skybridge Airlines. "Gentlemen, ladies," he began, his voice filling the space with quiet confidence. "What I'm about to show you will change the future of your airline." The presentation lasted 2 hours. Christopher walked them through every detail of the software system his company had designed. Real-time booking integration, artificial intelligence for customer service, predictive maintenance for aircraft, data analytics that could save millions in operational costs. The Skybridge executives watched, fascinated. Their CEO, Robert Patterson, leaned forward in his seat, asking question after question. Their CFO took notes frantically. Their head of operations smiled like Christmas had come early. By the end, they were ready to sign. "This is exactly what we need," Patterson said, shaking Christopher's hand firmly. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Johnson. TechVision Solutions is the best in the business." Christopher had built TechVision from nothing. 20 years ago, he'd been a software developer working out of his apartment, eating ramen noodles and teaching himself advanced programming at night. He'd had a vision, technology that could make complicated systems simple, software that worked for people, not against them. Now, TechVision employed over 3,000 people. They'd worked with hospitals, banks, government agencies, and Fortune 500 companies. Christopher had been featured in Forbes. He'd given TED Talks. He'd met with presidents and tech giants. But none of that mattered on Flight 447, because when Sarah Lewis looked at him, she didn't see a CEO. She didn't see a successful businessman. She didn't see 20 years of hard work and achievement. She saw a black man in first class, and she assumed he didn't belong there. The plane took off on time. Christopher sat in 34B, his laptop balanced awkwardly on the tray table. He tried to work, but the teenager next to him kept playing videos without headphones, and the woman on his other side had started snoring. He looked around the economy cabin. Families squeezed together. Business travelers hunched over their laptops in uncomfortable positions. Flight attendants rushing up and down the aisle, harried and stressed. These were the people Skybridge Airlines forgot about. The people who paid the bills but got the worst service. The people who made the airline profitable but were treated like cargo. Christopher thought about the software he designed for Skybridge. It would make everything more efficient, yes. It would save the company money. But would it make things better for these passengers? Or would it just help the airline pack more people into smaller spaces and charge them more for less? An hour into the flight, the captain's voice came over the speaker. "Folks, this is Captain Mike Rodriguez. We're cruising at 35,000 feet, and we should arrive in New York right on schedule. Flight attendants will be coming through with service shortly." The service came, but it was different in economy. Plastic cups instead of crystal, pretzels instead of warm nuts, water instead of champagne. The flight attendants moved quickly, efficiently, without the warmth they'd shown in first class. When the attendant reached Christopher's row, she barely looked at him. "Drink. Water, please." She handed him a plastic cup, already moving to the next row. Christopher sipped his water and thought about dignity, about respect, about how easily both could be stripped away. In first class, Jessica Harris was probably reclining in his seat right now, enjoying a hot meal on real plates. Sarah Lewis was probably smiling at her, offering her more champagne, treating her like royalty. And for what? Because she had connections. Because she was a valued customer. Because her skin was the right color and she knew the right people. Christopher wasn't angry anymore. Anger was hot and temporary. What he felt now was cold and permanent. A decision crystallizing in his mind, like ice forming on a window. He opened his email again. Read the contract details. Thought about the $280 million deal. Thought about what that money would mean for Skybridge. New aircraft, expanded routes, thousands of jobs, technological advancement. Then he thought about what that deal would mean if he walked away. He began typing an email. But he didn't send it yet. Not yet. First, he needed to finish this flight. He needed to walk off this plane with his head high. He needed to show them that they hadn't broken him, even though they'd tried. The plane touched down at JFK 3 hours later. Christopher remained in his seat as passengers around him scrambled for their bags. The overhead bins popped open. People pushed and shoved. The familiar chaos of deplaning began. He waited until the crowd thinned, then stood and retrieved his carry-on. His back ached from a cramped seat. His neck was stiff. He'd gotten no work done during the flight, and now he'd have to make up for lost time. As he walked toward the front of the plane, he passed through first class again. The cabin was empty now, except for flight attendants cleaning up. Sarah Lewis was collecting champagne flutes and folding blankets. She looked up as Christopher passed. For just a moment, their eyes met. Did she recognize him? Did she remember what she'd done? Her expression was blank, professional, already moving on to the next flight, the next set of passengers, the next day of treating people like problems to be managed. Christopher said nothing. He just kept walking. In the jetway, he pulled out his phone. The email he drafted sat in his outbox, waiting. He read it one more time. Subject, Final contract review, Skybridge Airlines Partnership. Dear Mr. Patterson, after careful consideration, TechVision Solutions has decided to withdraw from our proposed partnership with Skybridge Airlines. While we appreciate the time and effort your team has invested in this negotiation, we have concluded that our company's values are not aligned with your organization's practices. I experienced firsthand today how your airline treats its customers. I saw discrimination, bias, and a fundamental lack of respect for human dignity. As the CEO of TechVision, I cannot in good conscience provide technology that would support or enhance systems built on such foundations. I wish you the best in finding another partner for your technological needs. Sincerely, Christopher Johnson, CO, TechVision Solutions. His finger hovered over the send button. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about integrity, about standing up for what was right, even when it cost something, especially when it cost something. The deal was worth $280 million. Walking away meant losing that revenue. It meant disappointing his shareholders. It meant explaining to his employees why he'd turned down the biggest contract in company history. But it also meant looking at himself in the mirror and liking what he saw. Christopher pressed send. 45 minutes later, Christopher was in a taxi heading into Manhattan when his phone rang. Mr. Johnson? The voice was panicked, breathless. This is Margaret Chen. I'm the executive VP at Skybridge. Did you just send an email to Mr. Patterson? I did. There must be some mistake, some misunderstanding. The deal? There's no mistake, Christopher said calmly. I was on one of your flights this morning, Flight 447 from Dallas, and I saw exactly how your airline operates. Silence on the other end. Then what happened? Christopher told her every detail. The way Sarah Lewis had approached him. The assumption that he didn't belong in first class. The threat of security. The forced move to economy while Jessica Harris took his seat. More silence. Then, oh my God, your flight attendant didn't know who I was, Christopher continued. But that's exactly the point. She shouldn't have needed to know. Every passenger deserves respect, regardless of who they are or what they look like. But she decided, based on nothing but appearances, that I was less valuable than another passenger, and your airline system supported that decision. Mr. Johnson, I am so sorry. This is absolutely not. It is, Christopher interrupted. It is how your airline operates. Because if your systems allowed this to happen, if your training allowed this to happen, if your culture made this seem acceptable to that flight attendant, then this is exactly who you are as a company. Please, Margaret said, give us a chance to make this right. We need this deal. We need your technology. The whole company is counting on. I'm sure you'll find another vendor, Christopher said. Someone who doesn't care about your values. Someone who just wants the money. But that's not Tech Vision. That's not me. Mr. Johnson. Christopher hung up. The taxi rolled through Manhattan traffic. Around him, the city buzzed with energy. People rushing to meetings, vendors calling out to tourists, construction workers rebuilding streets. Life moving forward, indifferent to his small act of defiance. But it didn't feel small. It felt necessary. His phone rang again. Then again. Then again. He silenced it. The next morning, Christopher arrived at Tech Vision's headquarters in Silicon Valley. The building was glass and steel, modern and bright, overlooking the bay. His company, his life's work. His assistant, Maria, met him at the elevator with coffee and concern written all over her face. Christopher, the board wants an emergency meeting. They heard about Skybridge. Of course they did, he said, taking the coffee. Schedule it for this afternoon. The meeting was tense. 12 board members, all staring at him with varying degrees of confusion and frustration. You walked away from $280 million, asked David Chun, the head of the finance committee. Over a seat on an airplane? Not over a seat, Christopher said carefully. Over principles. Over the systematic devaluation of human dignity. Over the kind of discrimination that we, as a company, claim to stand against. But we have shareholders, another board member protested. Employees who depend on contracts like this. You can't just... I can, Christopher said. And I did. Because if we're only ethical when it's convenient, then we're not ethical at all. He stood up and walked to the window. Below, employees moved through the campus. Engineers, designers, salespeople, administrative staff. A diverse group of people who'd built something meaningful together. I started this company with nothing, Christopher continued, his back to the board. I built on the belief that technology should serve people, not exploit them. That means all people, not just the ones with money or connections or the right skin color. He turned back to face them. If we work with Skybridge, we're saying their values are acceptable. We're saying what happened to me, what happens to countless passengers every day, is just the cost of doing business. I'm not willing to say that. David Chin sighed. This is going to hurt us financially. Maybe, Christopher agreed. Or maybe it will show other companies that we actually mean what we say. Maybe it will attract clients who value integrity over profit. Maybe it will make us stronger. The room fell silent. Then, slowly, one board member started nodding. Then another. Then another. All right, David said finally. We trust your judgment. We always have. Christopher felt tension drain from his shoulders. Thank you. As he left the meeting, his phone buzzed. A news alert. Skybridge Airlines faces backlash after discrimination incident. Apparently, someone on Flight 447 had recorded part of the confrontation. The video was shaky, the audio poor, but it showed enough. Christopher being told to move. Sarah's dismissive tone. Jessica Harris taking a seat, without question. The video was going viral. Hashtag Boycott Skybridge was trending. Passengers were sharing their own stories of discrimination. The airline stock was dropping. Christopher hadn't wanted this. He just wanted to walk away quietly, to make his point through business rather than spectacle. But maybe this was better. Maybe people needed to see what happened. Maybe change only came when companies were forced to face consequences. 3 days later, Skybridge Airlines held a press conference. Robert Patterson, the CEO, stood at a podium looking tired and aged. Behind him, a screen showed the Skybridge logo, a bridge made of clouds, symbolizing connection and travel. We have failed, Patterson began. Not just one passenger, but many passengers over many years. The incident involving Mr. Christopher Johnson has forced us to confront hard truths about our company culture. The room was packed with journalists. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. We have terminated the employment of Sarah Lewis, Patterson continued. We are implementing mandatory bias training for all employees. We are reviewing our policies on seat assignments and customer service. And we are committing $50 million to diversity and inclusion initiatives. Is this enough to win back Mr. Johnson's business? A reporter called out. Patterson's expression was grim. Honestly, I don't know. I hope to speak with Mr. Johnson personally. But I understand if he never wants to work with us again. We have to earn back trust, and that takes time. Christopher watched the press conference from his office. Maria stood next to him, arms crossed. They're trying, she said. They're reacting, Christopher corrected. They're scared of losing money. That's not the same as actually changing. His phone rang. It was Patterson's number. Christopher stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he answered. Mr. Johnson, Patterson said, thank you for taking my call. Mr. Patterson, I won't waste your time with excuses. What happened to you is wrong. It was discriminatory, degrading, and completely unacceptable. I'm ashamed that it happened on one of our flights. Christopher waited. I know an apology isn't enough, Patterson continued. I know we need to demonstrate real change. But I'm asking, begging really, for a chance to show you that we can be better, that we want to be better. Why should I believe you? Christopher asked. Because I'm putting my own job on the line, Patterson said. I told our board that if we don't fix this fundamentally and permanently, I'll resign. This isn't about saving the company's reputation. It's about doing what's right. Christopher thought about this. He thought about the thousands of employees at Skybridge who had nothing to do with what happened on Flight 447. He thought about the passengers who depended on the airline. He thought about whether people and companies could really change. I need to see results, Christopher said finally. Not promises, not press conferences. Real, measurable change in how you treat passengers. All passengers. You'll see it, Patterson promised. I give you my word. Your word means nothing yet, Christopher said bluntly. But maybe in time it will. He hung up. Winter came to Silicon Valley. Christopher stood in his office, looking at a report on his desk. It was from an independent firm he'd hired to monitor Skybridge Airlines, to watch how they treated passengers, to document whether their promised changes were real. The report was thick. Christopher flipped through it slowly. New training programs, implemented and mandatory. Bias reporting systems, active and responsive. Policy changes, comprehensive and enforced. Employee reviews, including assessments of how they treated all passengers, not just the wealthy ones. And the statistics, complaint of discrimination, down 60%. Employee satisfaction up. Customer service ratings improving. The culture was actually changing. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect, but it was real progress. His phone rang. Patterson again. "I assume you've seen a report," Patterson said. "I have. We've been working hard. But I want you to know this isn't just about winning back your contract. This needed to happen regardless. You did us a favor by holding up a mirror." Christopher found himself smiling slightly. "A very expensive mirror. Worth every penny," Patterson said. "So, is there any chance we can talk about working together?" Christopher looked out at the bay. The water sparkled in the winter sun. Sailboats drifted across the surface, peaceful and unhurried. "Send me a new proposal," Christopher said. "We'll review it." "Thank you," Patterson said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Christopher warned. "We'll be watching. And if you backslide, if you return to old patterns, we're out immediately. No second chances." "Understood." After he hung up, Maria came in with coffee. "So," she asked. "So we'll see," Christopher said. "Maybe they've learned. Maybe they haven't. But at least now they're trying." "You could have just taken the money from the beginning," Maria pointed out. "Saved yourself all this trouble." Christopher shook his head. The trouble was worth it. Because now they know, everyone knows, that there are consequences for treating people as less than human. That money and status and skin color shouldn't determine how you're valued. "You think other companies are paying attention?" "I hope so," Christopher said. "I really hope so." 8 months after that day on Flight 447, Christopher found himself back at the airport. This time, he was flying Skybridge again, testing them, seeing if the changes were real or just for show. He checked in online, confirmed his first-class seat. 2A, the same seat he'd been forced to give up before. Then he went to the airport, went through security, and walked to his gate. The gate area was busy. Families with young children, business travelers on laptops, elderly couples holding hands. A cross-section of humanity, all waiting for the same plane. Christopher observed them. Nobody special. Nobody more or less important than anyone else. Just people trying to get somewhere. The boarding call came. First class first, as always. Christopher walked down the jetway and onto the plane. The first-class cabin looked the same. Leather seats, soft lighting, the smell of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. But something was different. The flight attendant who greeted him was a young man named Marcus. He smiled genuinely as Christopher approached. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Johnson. We're honored to have you with us today. Can I help you with your bag?" No assumptions, no judgment, just courtesy. "I've got it, thank you," Christopher said. He settled into seat 2, his seat, the one he'd paid for, the one he deserved. He pulled out his laptop and started working. Other passengers boarded. A mix of people, different ages, different races, different backgrounds. All treated with the same courtesy. All welcomed the same way. Halfway through boarding, an elderly black woman approached first class. She wore a church dress and carried a worn suitcase. She looked at her boarding pass, confused. "Excuse me," she said to Marcus. "I think there's been a mistake. This says 3B, but I'm sure I booked economy." Marcus checked his tablet. "No mistake, ma'am. You were upgraded as one of our loyal customers. You've flown with us for 30 years. That deserves recognition. Welcome to first class." The woman's eyes filled with tears. Oh my goodness. I've never sat in first class before." "Well, you're sitting there today," Marcus said warmly. "Let me help you with your bag." Christopher watched this interaction, watched the woman settle into her seat with wonder and joy, watched Marcus treat her with dignity and respect, not because she was important or wealthy, but simply because she was a person. Maybe things really were changing. The flight took off on time. The service was excellent. The meal was good. Christopher got work done. Everything proceeded normally. But normal felt different now. Normal felt like what it should have been all along. 2 hours into the flight, Christopher went to the bathroom. When he came back, he noticed someone sitting in the seat next to his. Seat 2B, which had been empty when he boarded. It was Jessica Harris. She was older than he remembered, her face more lined. She wore the same kind of expensive clothes, but she looked smaller somehow, diminished. She glanced up as he approached, and her eyes widened with recognition. "Oh," she said softly, "it's you." Christopher paused. He could have walked past her, could have ignored her, but something made him stop. "Mrs. Harris," he said evenly. She looked down at her hands. "I owe you an apology. For what happened? For taking your seat. For not saying anything." Christopher settled back into his seat. "You remember that day?" "How could I forget?" Jessica's voice was quiet. "I saw the video later, online. I saw what it looked like. What it was. I've thought about it every day since." "Why didn't you say something at the time?" Christopher asked, not accusatory, just curious. Jessica was silent for a long moment. "Because I was used to getting my way. Because I thought I deserved special treatment. Because..." She paused. "Because I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as an inconvenience. And I'm ashamed of that." "What changed?" Christopher asked. "I have a grandson," Jessica said. "He's 7. Beautiful boy. And he came home from school crying one day because other kids said he didn't belong in their group. He wasn't welcome. And I thought about how that felt for him, to be excluded, to be treated as less important. And then I thought about what I'd done to you." She looked at Christopher directly now, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm truly deeply sorry." Christopher studied her. He could see that she meant it, that she genuinely changed, or at least was trying to. "I accept your apology," he said. "Thank you," Jessica whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "No," Christopher agreed. "But holding on to anger doesn't hurt you. It hurts me, and I'm tired of carrying it." They sat in silence for a while. Two people who'd once represented everything wrong with the world. Now just two humans sharing space on a plane. "What you did to the airline," Jessica said eventually. "Walking away from all that money. That took courage." "It took necessity," Christopher corrected. "I couldn't live with myself otherwise." "Still," Jessica said, "you changed things. My grandson's school started teaching about dignity and respect after your story went viral. Teachers are talking about it. Kids are learning. You made a difference." Christopher hadn't known that. He'd been so focused on the business side, the contracts, the policies, the corporate changes, that he hadn't thought about the ripples spreading wider. "That's good to hear," he said quietly. "You could have destroyed me," Jessica continued. "My name was in the news. People recognized me. I lost friends. But you never called for that. You never made it personal." "Because it wasn't personal," Christopher said. "It was systemic. You were just a product of a system that told you that you mattered more than other people. The real enemy was the system, not you." Jessica nodded slowly. "I'm trying to be better, to see people better. It's harder than I thought it would be, unlearning a lifetime of assumptions." "Keep trying," Christopher said. "That's all any of us can do." When the plane landed in New York, Christopher had an email waiting. It was from Patterson, with a subject line that read, "Final proposal, Partnership 2.0. Christopher opened it during the taxi ride to his hotel. The new contract was different from the original. It was actually smaller in dollar value, $180 million, instead of $280 million. But the terms were better, more focused, more aligned with TechVision's values. And it included something new, a requirement that Skybridge would donate 1% of all revenue from the system to organizations fighting discrimination and promoting equality, every year, in perpetuity. Christopher read through the entire proposal. It was good, really good. It showed that Skybridge had been listening, learning, changing. He called Patterson. "I got your proposal," Christopher said. And Patterson sounded nervous. "It's acceptable. Send over the final paperwork, and we'll sign." "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it," Christopher confirmed. "You've done the work. You've earned a second chance." "Thank you," Patterson said, emotion clear in his voice. "Thank you so much. We won't let you down." "See that you don't," Christopher said. That night, Christopher stood at the window of his hotel room, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. The city glittered with millions of lights, millions of people, millions of stories. His phone buzzed with congratulations from his team. The contract was signed. TechVision would be working with Skybridge after all, but on terms that reflected who they were as a company, who he was as a person. He thought about that day on Flight 447, about the humiliation, the anger, the choice he'd made to walk away instead of compromising his principles. It had cost him time. It had cost him stress. It had cost him relationships and opportunities. But it had earned him something more valuable, the knowledge that he could look at himself in the mirror and be proud of what he saw. 6 months after the new contract was signed, Christopher was invited to speak at a business conference in Chicago. The topic, ethics in business, when principles cost money. The auditorium was packed. Entrepreneurs, CEOs, business students, all want to hear about the man who'd walked away from $280 million and somehow ended up stronger for it. Christopher stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. "I want to tell you about a seat on an airplane," he began. He told them everything. The incident on Flight 447, the decision to cancel the contract, the backlash, the changes, the eventual partnership on better terms. "But here's what I learned," Christopher continued. "It was never about the money. It was never even about the airline. It was about asking ourselves a simple question. Who do we want to be when no one is watching?" He paused, letting the words sink in. In business, we talk a lot about values. Every company has them printed on their walls, written on their websites, recited in meetings. But values only matter when they cost us something. When following them means losing money or opportunities or comfort. A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "But how do you know when to take that stand? How do you know when it's worth it?" Christopher smiled. "You know because your gut tells you, because you can't sleep at night, because every time you think about taking the easy path, something inside you says no." He walked away from the podium, moving closer to the audience. "Here's the truth that business schools don't teach you. Success built on compromise eats away at you. You might get rich. You might get famous. You might get everything you thought you wanted. But if you got it by ignoring injustice, by accepting discrimination, by looking the other way when people were treated as less than human, then what do you really have?" The room was completely silent. "I walked away from that contract because I had to," Christopher continued, "because staying would have meant betraying everything I'd built TechVision to be. And yes, it was scary. Yes, my board questioned me. Yes, I had sleepless nights wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. But then something interesting happened. Other companies started reaching out. Companies that had seen what we did and respected it. Companies that wanted to work with a business that actually stood for something. We didn't just survive, we grew. Because integrity, it turns out, is actually good business." An older man in the back stood up. "But what about your shareholders? Don't you have a responsibility to maximize profit?" "I have a responsibility to build a company that lasts," Christopher replied. "And companies built on greed and compromise don't last. They crumble when the foundation cracks. I'd rather build something smaller and solid than something massive and hollow." The questions continued for another hour. By the end, Christopher was exhausted but energized. These people, these future leaders, they were listening. They were thinking. Maybe they'd remember this moment when they faced their own difficult choices. Across the country, in a small apartment in Dallas, Sarah Lewis sat on her couch watching the news. Christopher Johnson's face filled the screen. He was receiving an award from a civil rights organization for corporate courage in the face of discrimination. Sarah's hand shook as she held her coffee mug. She'd been fired from Skybridge 10 months ago. The termination had been immediate, public, humiliating. Her name had been in every news article. Her face had been recognized on the street. Job applications had been rejected as soon as potential employers Googled her name. She lost everything because of one decision, one moment of judgment that she couldn't take back. But here's what nobody knew. Sarah had been raised in a small town where everyone looked like her, where assumptions about race and class were part of the air she breathed. She'd never questioned those assumptions. She'd never examined the biases that lived in her mind like uninvited guests. Until that day on Flight 447, when her assumptions had collided with reality and destroyed her life. She'd been angry at first. Angry at Christopher for making a big deal out of nothing. Angry at Skybridge for not protecting her. Angry at the world for turning against her. But slowly, as months passed and she was forced to confront what she'd done, the anger turned to something else. Understanding. Shame. Regret. She saw now what she hadn't seen then. That Christopher Johnson wasn't a black man who didn't belong in first class. He was just a man, a person, someone who'd paid for a seat and deserved to sit in it, someone whose dignity she'd casually discarded because of prejudices she didn't even know she had. Sarah set down her coffee and opened her laptop. She'd been working on something for weeks, a letter. She'd written it and deleted it a dozen times. But watching Christopher receive that award, hearing him talk about change and growth and second chances, she knew it was time to send it. Dear Mr. Johnson, you don't know me beyond the worst moment of my life. I'm Sarah Lewis, the flight attendant who asked you to give up your seat on Flight 447. I don't expect you to read this. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need to say these things, whether you hear them or not. What I did to you was wrong. Not just wrong, cruel, discriminatory, dehumanizing. I made assumptions about you based on nothing but your skin color. I treated you as if you were less important, less worthy, less human than another passenger. And I'm deeply, profoundly ashamed. I've spent the last 10 months trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could do that, how I could be so blind to my own prejudices, how I could hurt someone and not even realize in that moment that I was hurting them. I've been going to therapy. I've been reading books about bias and racism. I've been volunteering with organizations that fight discrimination, not to rebuild my reputation. That's gone and I accept that, but to rebuild myself, to become the person I should have been all along. You didn't just lose a seat that day. You lost dignity, peace, the simple right to travel without being judged and diminished. I took those things from you, and I can never give them back. But I want you to know that your response, walking away from that contract, holding Skybridge accountable, using your platform to demand change, it taught me more than any lecture or training ever could. You showed me that actions have consequences, that people matter more than money, that dignity is not negotiable. I'm working as a cashier now at a grocery store. It's honest work, and I'm grateful for it. And every day when customers come through my line, I try to see them, really see them, not their clothes or their credit cards or the color of their skin, just people, human beings deserving of respect. I don't expect your forgiveness. I haven't earned it, but I wanted you to know that you changed me, that the worst thing I ever did led to the most important growth I've ever experienced, that I'm trying to be better. Thank you for holding up a mirror, even though I hated what I saw in it. With sincere regret and respect, Sarah Lewis. She read it one more time, then pressed send before she could change her mind. Christopher received Sarah's email at midnight. He'd just returned to his hotel after the awards dinner. He was tired, ready for sleep, but something made him check his email one last time. When he saw Sarah Lewis's name in his inbox, his first instinct was to delete it, but curiosity won out. He opened it. He read the letter slowly, carefully. Then he read it again. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and thought for a long time. This woman had humiliated him, had stripped away his dignity in front of strangers, had treated him as if he were nothing because of the color of his skin. He should hate her. He should feel satisfaction at her downfall. He should delete this email and never think about her again. But what he actually felt was something more complicated. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but recognition, the understanding that people can change. That growth often comes from our worst moments. That redemption, while never guaranteed, is at least possible. He thought about what his mother used to tell him when he was young. Christopher, hurt people, but healed people heal people. Sarah Lewis had hurt him, but she was trying to heal. Did that matter? Should it matter? Christopher began typing a response. He wrote it carefully, choosing each word with precision. Dear Ms. Lewis, I received your letter. Thank you for your honesty. I won't tell you that everything is fine or that I forgive you, because neither of those things is true. What you did caused real harm, not just to me, but the principle that all people deserve equal dignity and respect. But I will tell you this, your letter took courage. Real self-examination is painful. Most people would rather defend their actions than confront them. The fact that you're doing the hard work of understanding your own biases, that matters. You asked for forgiveness, but here's what I think you should know. Forgiveness isn't the goal. Growth is. Becoming a person who would never make that choice again, that's the goal. And it sounds like you're on that path. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. I don't know if you'll ever fully overcome the consequences of your actions. But I hope you continue the work you've started. I hope you help other people see their own blind spots. I hope you turn your worst moment into a catalyst for good. That's not absolution. It's just acknowledgement that people are complex, growth is real, and change is possible. I wish you well in your journey. Christopher Johnson. He sent the email, then closed his laptop. He thought about justice and mercy, about punishment and redemption, about how easy it is to condemn and how hard it is to understand. Sarah Lewis had lost her career, her reputation, her sense of self. In some ways, she'd paid a heavy price for a moment of bias. But Christopher had paid a price too. The price of being judged by his skin color, of being treated as less than, of having his dignity questioned. Who decides when the accounts are balanced? Who determines when justice has been served? Christopher didn't know. He just knew that holding on to anger was exhausting, that refusing to acknowledge growth was its own kind of blindness, that the world needed more healing and less hatred. Maybe that was enough. The anniversary of Flight 447 came quietly. Christopher was in his office when Maria knocked on the door. You have visitors, she said, smiling mysteriously. I don't have any appointments scheduled. I know, but trust me, you'll want to see these people. Curious, Christopher followed her to the conference room. Inside, he found an unexpected group. Robert Patterson from Skybridge Airlines, Marcus, the flight attendant from his return flight, the elderly woman who'd been upgraded to first class, and a dozen other people he didn't recognize. What is this? Christopher asked. Patterson stepped forward. This is a thank you from all of us whose lives you changed. One by one, the people in the room introduced themselves and told their stories. A young black man who'd been inspired by Christopher's story to start his own tech company. A mother who taught her children about standing up for what's right, using Christopher as an example. A flight attendant who joined Skybridge after the changes, feeling safe for the first time to be herself at work. A civil rights attorney who'd used the publicity around the incident to push for broader changes in the airline industry. Each person represented a ripple, a consequence of that one decision on that one flight a year ago. Christopher felt his throat tighten with emotion. I didn't do anything special, he said quietly. I just couldn't accept being treated that way. That's exactly what made it special, Patterson said. You had the courage to say no, when saying yes would have been easier, and that gave the rest of us permission to demand better. The elderly woman from the upgraded flight approached Christopher. She took his hand. I flew for 30 years, she said, her voice soft but firm. 30 years of being treated, as if I should be grateful for whatever scraps they gave me. 30 years of seeing people who looked like me stuck in the back while others got luxury. But after what you did, after the changes, I finally got to sit in first class, and they treated me like I mattered. Tears ran down her cheeks. You gave me that gift, she continued, the gift of dignity, and I'll never forget it. Christopher hugged her, this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. They were connected by shared experience, by the common understanding of what it meant to be underestimated, overlooked, and finally seen. 2 years after Flight 447, a filmmaker named Angela Martinez approached Christopher about making a documentary. Your story resonates because it's both specific and universal, Angela explained. It's about racism on an airplane, but it's really about dignity everywhere, about the small moments when we choose to stand up or stay silent, about how individual actions can create systemic change. Christopher was hesitant at first. He didn't want to be seen as someone who'd built his reputation on being a victim. He didn't want the incident to define him more than his actual work did. But Angela convinced him that the documentary could be bigger than his personal story. It could examine how discrimination persists in everyday settings, how companies respond to accountability, how change happens slowly but inevitably when people refuse to accept the unacceptable. The documentary, titled C2A, premiered at Sundance Film Festival. It was powerful and nuanced, interviewing not just Christopher but also Sarah Lewis, who participated nervously but honestly, Jessica Harris, Skybridge employees, and dozens of passengers who'd experienced similar discrimination. The film didn't offer easy answers. It showed Sarah's genuine remorse alongside the real harm she'd caused. It showed Skybridge's improvements alongside persistent problems in the airline industry. It showed Christopher's dignity alongside his very human anger and hurt. Critics called it a masterclass in complexity. A film that refuses to let anyone off the hook while also acknowledging that people can grow. The kind of documentary that starts conversations instead of ending them. At the premiere, Christopher sat in the audience between his wife, Patricia, who'd supported him through everything, and his daughter, Maya, who'd been so proud when he'd walked away from the contract. As the credits rolled, the audience gave a standing ovation. But Christopher wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the screen, where the final shot showed an empty first-class seat with a small placard. This seat is for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. 5 years after Flight 447, Christopher gave a talk at his daughter's college. Maya Johnson was now a law student at Harvard, specializing in civil rights. She'd been 8 years old when the incident happened, and had shaped her understanding of justice, fairness, and the power of principled action. As Christopher stood before the auditorium full of students, he saw his daughter in the front row, beaming with pride. "When I was your age," Christopher began, "I thought success meant money, status, recognition. I worked incredibly hard to build my company because I wanted to prove something, to myself, to my family, to everyone who'd ever underestimated me." He paused, looking around the room. "And then I sat on an airplane and got asked to give up my seat because of the color of my skin. And in that moment, all the money and status and recognition meant nothing, because I was still just a black man who someone assumed didn't belong." The students listened intently. "But here's what I learned. Success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about who you become. It's about whether you can look at yourself in the mirror and feel proud of the choices you made, especially the hard ones." A young woman raised her hand. "But don't you regret losing all that money from the original contract?" Christopher smiled. "I used to ask myself that question, especially during the hard months when I wasn't sure if Skybridge would change, or if other companies would respect our decision, or if walking away had been naive. But then I think about the alternative. I think about what it would have felt like to take that money knowing how I'd been treated, to work with a company that had devalued my humanity, to teach my daughter that principles are negotiable if the price is high enough." He looked directly at Maya. "I think about what kind of man I'd be if I'd made that choice. And I realize I don't regret anything, because the person I became by walking away is someone I actually like, someone my daughter can be proud of." Maya wiped tears from her eyes. Another student asked, "What advice would you give us when we face similar choices?" Christopher thought carefully before answering. "First, know your values before you need them, because in the moment of crisis, you won't have time to figure out what you believe. You'll only have time to act on beliefs you've already established. Second, understand that doing the right thing often costs something. If it's easy, everyone would do it. The cost is what makes it meaningful. Third, remember that you're not just making a choice for yourself. You're making it for everyone who comes after you. Your daughter, your community, the young person who's watching and learning what's possible. And finally," he concluded, "trust that integrity compounds. Maybe not immediately, maybe not in ways you expect, but over time, people notice. Opportunities come, doors open, not because you were strategic, but because you were authentic." The applause was thunderous. After the talk, students lined up to speak with Christopher. They shared their own stories of discrimination, their fears about compromising their values, their hopes for creating a more just world. Christopher listened to each one, offering encouragement and wisdom, and he realized that this connection, this passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, this was what success actually looked like. 7 years after Flight 447, Christopher received an unexpected invitation. Skybridge Airlines was celebrating its 75th anniversary with a gala dinner. They wanted Christopher to be the keynote speaker. He almost declined. The incident was years in the past. He'd moved on. Did he really want to revisit it publicly? But something made him say yes. Maybe curiosity. Maybe closure. Maybe the sense that there was one more chapter to this story. The gala was held at a fancy hotel in Chicago. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and well-dressed guests. Current and former employees mingled with business partners and industry leaders. When Christopher arrived, Patterson greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming," Patterson said. "I know it might have been difficult." "It's been 7 years," Christopher said. "I think enough time has passed." "Has it?" Patterson asked seriously. "I still think about that day, about how close we came to being just another company that talked about values without living them." They walked into the ballroom together. As Christopher entered, the crowd turned, and then, to his surprise, they began to applaud. Not polite applause. Real applause. Sustained and genuine. Christopher looked around, confused. This was supposed to be Skybridge's celebration, not his. But Patterson leaned over and whispered, "They're thanking you, all of them, because you made us better." The applause continued for a full minute. Christopher saw flight attendants clapping, pilots clapping, executives clapping, people whose jobs were better, whose workplace was healthier, whose consciences were clearer, because one man had refused to accept discrimination. When the applause finally died down, dinner was served. Christopher found himself seated at a table with an interesting group. Current Skybridge executives, civil rights leaders, and, to his surprise, Sarah Lewis. She looked older, her face lined with experience. But there was something different about her, a calmness, a groundedness that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, "thank you for the email you sent years ago. It meant more than you know." "You've been working with Skybridge?" Christopher asked, surprised. "In a way," Sarah explained. "I'm part of their bias training program now. I share my story with new employees. I tell them what I did, why it was wrong, and what I learned. It's painful every time, but it's necessary." Christopher studied her. "That takes courage." "No," Sarah said. "What you did took courage. I'm just trying to make amends." During dinner, they talked, really talked. For the first time, Sarah shared her journey of growth. The therapy, the reading, the slow, painful process of unlearning a lifetime of unconscious bias. "I'll never be done with this work," she said, "because bias isn't something you fix once and move on. It's something you have to examine every day, in every interaction, for the rest of your life." "That's true for all of us," Christopher said. "We all have blind spots. We all have prejudices we don't see. The question is whether we're willing to look." Later, when Christopher stood to give his keynote speech, he looked out at the crowd and thought about how to sum up 7 years of lessons. "I want to tell you a story," he began, "about a seat on an airplane." He told them everything, the same way he always did. The humiliation, the anger, the decision, the consequences, the changes. But this time, he added something new. "I've spent 7 years being asked about that day," Christopher said. "And people always want to know the same thing. Was it worth it? Was walking away from $280 million worth it?" He paused. "Here's my answer. That's the wrong question, because it assumes that money and principles are on equal scales, that we can weigh dignity against dollars and see which is heavier. But that's not how it works. Money comes and goes. Contract gets signed and canceled. Businesses rise and fall. But your integrity, your sense of who you are and what you stand for, that's permanent. That's the foundation everything else is built on. So when people ask if it was worth it, what they're really asking is, Is your soul worth $280 million? And the answer is no. Your soul is priceless. Your dignity is priceless. Your principles are priceless. The room was completely silent. Skybridge Airlines changed after that day on Flight 447. Christopher continued, not because I'm special or heroic, but because they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were treating some passengers as more valuable than others. And once you see that truth, you can't unsee it. You either change or you live with the knowledge that you're complicit. They chose to change. And that choice, that ongoing daily choice to do better, is what we're really celebrating tonight. Christopher looked at Patterson, at Sarah, at the hundreds of employees in the room. Change is possible, he said, for people, for companies, for society. But it only happens when someone refuses to accept the unacceptable. When someone says, no, this isn't good enough, we can do better. 7 years ago, I said no to discrimination. Skybridge said yes to change. And together, we prove that business and ethics don't have to be enemies. That profit and principles can coexist. That doing the right thing isn't just morally correct. It's actually good strategy. The applause was immediate and overwhelming. As Christopher sat down, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not just satisfaction or pride, but genuine peace. The kind that comes from knowing you've done what you were supposed to do, said what needed to be said, lived the way you were meant to live. That night, back in his hotel room, Christopher couldn't sleep. His mind was too full. Memories of the past 7 years, thoughts about legacy, questions about what it all meant. So he did what he often did when his thoughts were too big to contain. He wrote a letter to his daughter. Dear Maya, by the time you read this, you'll be a lawyer. You'll be out there fighting for justice in ways I never could. And I'll be so proud of you, the same way I've been proud of you every day of your life. But I want to tell you about something while I still remember the details. I want to tell you about the day on the airplane, the day that changed everything. You were 8 years old when it happened. You probably don't remember much of it, but I remember how you looked at me when I came home and told you what happened. Your eyes got very wide and you said, "That's not fair, Daddy." You were right. It wasn't fair. But here's what I learned. Life is full of unfair moments. Moments when people judge you by how you look instead of who you are. Moments when the rules don't apply equally to everyone. Moments when doing what's easy and doing what's right are two completely different things. And in those moments, you have a choice. You can accept the unfairness and move on. You can stay silent and protect yourself. You can take the money and ignore the compromise. Or you can say no. I chose to say no. And Maya, it was hard. So hard. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake. If I'd sacrificed our family security for some abstract principle. If I was being naive or stubborn or foolish. But then I'd think about you. About the person I wanted you to become. About the lessons I was teaching you. Not with my words, but with my actions. And I realized, if I accepted discrimination when it happened to me, how could I teach you to fight it when it happened to others? If I compromised my principles for money, how could I expect you to value integrity? If I stayed silent in the face of injustice, how could I ask you to speak up? I couldn't. So I didn't. You're going to face your own moments of choice. Maya, maybe they'll involve money, like mine did. Maybe they'll involve career opportunities or social pressure, or just the exhaustion of always having to be the one who speaks up. And in those moments, I want you to remember this. Your integrity is your inheritance. Not the money I'll leave you or the company I built. Those things are just things. But your sense of who you are, what you stand for, what you refuse to compromise, that's what I'm really passing down to you. The world will try to tell you that principles are expensive, that doing the right thing costs too much, that you have to be realistic and practical and willing to bend. But here's the secret they don't want you to know. Living without integrity is actually more expensive. It costs you sleep. It costs you self-respect. It costs you the ability to look at yourself in the mirror and like what you see. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if the changes at Skybridge will last. I don't know if my story will matter in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. But I know this. I can look at you without shame. I can tell you about the hardest decision I ever made and know that I made the right choice. I can teach you about dignity and justice and courage not as abstract concepts, but as lived realities. That's worth more than $280 million. That's worth more than anything. Be brave, my daughter. Be principled. Be the person who refuses to accept injustice, even when fighting it costs something, especially when fighting it costs something. Because that's how we change the world, one courageous choice at a time. All my love, Dad. Christopher sealed the letter in an envelope. He'd give it to Maya when she graduated from law school. She'd read it and cry, and they'd talk about everything, the fear, the doubt, the eventual triumph. But for now, he just needed to write it, to capture these thoughts while they were still fresh, to ensure that the lessons of Flight 447 lived on, even after he was gone. 10 years after Flight 447, Christopher Johnson stood in an airport once again. He was older now. His hair was fully silver. Reading glasses perched on his nose. But he still carried himself with that same quiet dignity that had defined him all those years ago. He was traveling to New York for his daughter's graduation. Maya had finished law school and passed the bar. She'd already accepted a position at a civil rights organization, ready to begin her life's work. Christopher checked in at the Skybridge counter. The agent smiled warmly at him. "Mr. Johnson, welcome back. You're in seat 2A today." Christopher took his boarding pass and smiled. "Thank you." As he walked through the airport, he noticed something. The world looked different than it had 10 years ago. Not perfect, far from it, but different. There were more diversity initiatives, more bias training, more awareness of how easily discrimination could slip into everyday interactions. Companies were being held accountable in ways they hadn't been before. Had his actions on Flight 447 caused all of this? Of course not. Change was never that simple. But he'd been part of it. One voice among many. One action that rippled outward and joined with thousands of other actions to create something larger. At the gate, Christopher noticed a young black man standing nervously with his boarding pass. The man kept looking at it, then at the gate, as if he couldn't quite believe he was in the right place. Christopher walked over to him. "First time in first class?" The young man startled. "Yes, sir. I just got promoted at work, and they upgraded me. But I keep thinking there's been a mistake." Christopher smiled. "There's no mistake. You earned that seat. Hold your head high when you board that plane." "Thank you," the young man said. Then, looking more closely at Christopher, his eyes widened. "Wait, are you Christopher Johnson? From the story?" "I'm Christopher Johnson," Christopher confirmed. "Though I'm not sure I'm from any particular story. I'm just a man who took a trip." "No," the young man said firmly. "You're more than that. My mom told me about what you did. She said you taught her that our dignity isn't negotiable, that we don't have to accept being treated as less than." Christopher felt his throat tighten. "Your mom sounds wise." "She works for Skybridge now," the young man continued. "She's a pilot. She said she never would have applied if it weren't for the changes you pushed for. She said the old company wouldn't have welcomed someone like her." "Someone like her?" "A black woman from the south side of Chicago who learned to fly in the military." The young man said proudly, "She's Captain Williams now. She might be flying this plane, actually." Christopher smiled. "Then we're in good hands." The boarding call came. First class was invited to board first. Christopher and the young man walked down the jetway together, talking about careers and choices and the long road toward justice. When they entered the plane, Christopher looked around the first-class cabin. It looked the same as it had 10 years ago. Leather seats, soft lighting, expensive cologne in the air. But everything was different. The flight attendant who greeted them was warm and genuine, seeing them as people rather than problems. The other passengers were diverse, different races, different backgrounds, all treated with equal respect. The announcements acknowledged everyone's presence, everyone's importance. This was what change looked like. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a quiet shift of a culture that had decided to do better. Christopher settled into seat 2A, his seat, the one he'd been forced to give up 10 years ago, the the one that had become a symbol of something larger than itself. As the plane filled with passengers, the cockpit door opened. A voice came over the speaker. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Williams. Welcome to Flight 447 to New York." Christopher closed his eyes and smiled. Flight 447, the same flight number, 10 years later. But everything was different. The captain finished her announcements, and the plane began to taxi. Christopher looked out the window at the airport below. People rushing, planes taking off, the constant motion of travel and connection. He thought about the journey he'd taken. Not just the physical journeys on airplanes, but the larger journey of principle and consequence and change. He thought about Sarah Lewis, now teaching others about bias, about Jessica Harris, trying to be a better person, about Patterson and Skybridge, working every day to live up to their new values, about his daughter Maya, about to begin her own fight for justice. He thought about all the people whose lives had been touched by one decision on one flight, the ripples spreading outward, touching shores he'd never see. And he thought about that young man sitting a few rows ahead, flying first class for the first time, holding his head high because someone had told him his dignity wasn't negotiable. That was the real legacy of Flight 447, not the canceled contract or the viral video or the documentary or the speeches, but the simple, powerful idea that every person deserves respect. That dignity is not earned through status or wealth or skin color, that we all belong. The plane lifted off the ground, rising into the sky. Christopher opened his laptop and began to work. Just another passenger on another flight. Nothing special, nothing dramatic, except that he'd helped change the world, one seat at a time. Years from now, business students will study the case of Christopher Johnson and Skybridge Airlines. They'll analyze the financial impact of his decision. They'll debate whether walking away from $280 million was strategic or stubborn. They'll write papers about corporate social responsibility and the cost of integrity. But they'll miss the real lesson. The real lesson isn't about business. It's about humanity. It's about the fact that every single day, we make choices about how we treat other people. Some of those choices feel small. How we speak to a service worker, whether we intervene when we see injustice, how we react when someone different from us enters our space. But those small choices add up. They create culture. They reinforce systems. They tell people whether they matter. Christopher Johnson's story isn't remarkable because he was a CEO or because he canceled a major deal. It's remarkable because he refused to accept being treated as less than human. And in refusing, he reminded everyone that dignity is not negotiable. You don't have to be a CEO to make that choice. You don't have to have $280 million on the line. You just have to be willing to say, no, this isn't acceptable. I deserve better. We all deserve better. That's the lesson of Flight 447. Not that one man changed an airline, but that one man's refusal to accept discrimination rippled outward, touching thousands of lives, creating change that would last for generations. And the most beautiful part? It all started with something simple. A person who knew their worth, who refused to be diminished, who chose dignity over convenience. That person could be anyone. That person could be you. The next time you see injustice, whether it's happening to you or to someone else, remember Christopher Johnson sitting in seat 34B, typing an email that would change everything. Remember that you have power, not the power of money or status or connections, the power of choice, the power to say no, the power to demand better. Use it, because the world changes when ordinary people make extraordinary choices. When they refuse to accept the unacceptable, when they stand up even when it costs something, especially when it costs something. That's how we build a better world, not through grand gestures or perfect heroes, but through everyday people making brave choices in difficult moments, one seat at a time, one person at a time, one moment of courage at a time, until eventually the world looks different than it did before, until everyone knows they belong, until dignity is no longer negotiable, until we all get to sit in the seats we paid for, work in spaces we've earned, and walk through the world with our heads held high, not because of what we look like or who we know, but simply because we're human. That's the world Christopher Johnson fought for. That's the world we all deserve. And that's the world we can create if we're willing to pay the price of integrity, courage, and unwavering commitment to what's right. The plane flies on. The journey continues. The work is never finished. But every day we get to choose. Will we be the ones who perpetuate injustice or the ones who challenge it? Will we be Sarah Lewis before her awakening or Sarah Lewis after her transformation? Will we be Jessica Harris taking what isn't rightfully ours or Jessica Harris learning to see others as fully human? Will we be the businessman who looks away or the person who speaks up? The choice is always ours. Christopher Johnson made his choice on Flight 447 10 years ago. What choice will you make today? This story is about more than one man's experience on one flight. It's about the everyday battle for dignity that millions of people face. It's about the invisible biases that shape how we treat each other. It's about the courage it takes to stand up for yourself when the world tells you to stay quiet. But most importantly, it's about the fact that change is possible. People can grow. Companies can transform. Society can evolve. But only if someone is willing to start the process. Only if someone is willing to say, this isn't good enough, and refuse to participate in systems of discrimination. Here are the key lessons. 1. Dignity is priceless. No amount of money, convenience, or social pressure is worth compromising your sense of self-worth. When you accept being treated as less than human, you teach the world that it's okay to devalue you. 2. Your actions have ripples. Christopher didn't know that his decision would inspire thousands of people, change company policies, or create a documentary. He just knew he couldn't live with himself if he accepted discrimination. But his choice rippled outward in ways he could never have predicted. 3. Courage doesn't mean fearlessness. Christopher was afraid. He worried about the consequences. He had sleepless nights. But he acted anyway, because courage is about doing what's right despite the fear, not in the absence of it. 4. Change takes time. Skybridge didn't transform overnight. Sarah didn't overcome her biases immediately. Real change is slow, messy, and requires sustained effort. But it's possible if people commit to the work. 5. Everyone has blind spots. We all carry unconscious biases. We all have moments when we judge people unfairly. The question is whether we're willing to examine those biases and do the hard work of change. 6. Accountability matters. Christopher held Skybridge accountable by walking away. The public held him accountable through social media and boycotts. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about creating consequences that motivate change. 7. Redemption is possible. Sarah Lewis did something terrible, but she also did the work of transformation. She faced her actions honestly and committed to being better. That doesn't erase the harm, but it does show that people can grow. 8. Systems matter more than individuals. The problem wasn't just Sarah's bias. It was the airline's policies that allowed her bias to become action. Real change requires examining and reforming the systems that enable discrimination. 9. You don't need power to make a difference. Christopher's power came not from being a CEO, but from having clear principles and the courage to stand by them. Anyone can refuse to accept injustice. Anyone can demand better. 10. Integrity compounds. In the short term, walking away from $280 million seemed costly. But over time, Christopher's integrity attracted better opportunities, deeper relationships, and a legacy worth more than money. Doing the right thing pays dividends, even if you can't see them immediately. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. You matter. Your dignity matters. How you treat others matters. The choices you make, even the small ones that feel insignificant, matter. Every time you speak up for someone who's being treated unfairly, you change the world a little bit. Every time you refuse to participate in discrimination, you make dignity more accessible for everyone. Every time you choose integrity over convenience, you become the kind of person who builds a better future. The world needs more Christopher Johnsons, not because he was perfect or heroic, but because he was human enough to say, this isn't right, and brave enough to do something about it. The world needs more people who value dignity over dollars. The world needs more people who stand up when it would be easier to stay seated. The world needs you. So the next time you face a choice between what's easy and what's right, remember Flight 447. Remember that one person's courage can change thousands of lives. Remember that dignity is never negotiable. And then make your choice. The world is watching. But more importantly, you're watching yourself. Who do you want to be? The answer to that question will shape everything that comes next. Choose well. Choose bravely. Choose dignity. Every time.